Good day, dear listeners. I am Andrei Smirnov, and today, along with my colleague Sutovsky, we are going to touch upon very interesting work of Tsang. This book is called Governing Hong Kong, and it introduces the history of Hong Kong from 1862 to 1997, the evolution of its administration and the development of it from becoming the British colony, being under British governance, to the point of handover to China. First and foremost, in this book, Tsang raised the problem of Hong Kong colonial administration during British governance, also issues regarding managing community and how Hong Kong overcame it. Drawing on the history, in 1840 Britain officially proclaimed war to China, requiring alienation of the Hong Kong island, while China rejected it. Nonetheless, in 1841 China under Tsang dynasty was forced to agree to the cession of the island, and Hong Kong was declared as a British colony on the 26th of January 1841. Hong Kong was the easternmost outpost of the British Empire in Asia. Governance in the formative years of British colonial rule was not a matter of pride for either the colonists or the British. Most of the Europeans who went to Hong Kong in the mid-19th century were adventurers, merchants dedicated to making a quick profit. Hong Kong didn't have in place either a formal local government or a well-entrenched group of scholars, gentry, and had troubles regarding the colonial administration and organization. Colonial society in the early decades of British Hong Kong was characterized by the politics of small community. Early colonial Hong Kong didn't produce an environment conducive to efficient administration or teamwork within the government. At that time in Hong Kong were observed the lack of qualified professionals in public service and also the smallness of the expatriate population, what led to the absence of a line between public and private service. In the mid-19th century, the relationship between an expat colonist and a Chinese person was an equal one. Chinese were treated as criminals by Britain. The colonial government and its magistrates were inherently discriminatory in their dealings with the Chinese. The Hong Kong government had muddled through its first 2 decades without an adequate means of communication with the bulk of the local population. The idea of selfless and devoted modern civil service was only a germination in the early part of the 20th century in Britain. That is why such problems touch the quality of colonial Hong Kong administration.
So, the British government introduced a civil service commission to recruit and promote a portion of officials and a basis of competitive examination rather than patronage. Robinson, who became a colonial administration chief after Bowring, was keen to ensure that the government should be accurately informed of what the Chinese really wanted or needed or wished to say. Recruitment by competitive examination was only introduced to the Straits Settlement Civil Service in 1869, and at a such later date in Malaya. All candidates would have to be natural-born British subjects. Cadets recruited from diverse backgrounds were recruited because they happened to be available. All the cadets received good educations prior to the recruitment, and cadets learned Chinese, and large attention was dedicated to it, but finally must become from language cadets to state employee. In Hong Kong, modern civil service based on merit was built, and it played a significant role. Thereby, the introduction of cadets eventually created in Hong Kong a modern British bureaucratic elite that appeared to share some elements of the Chinese Mandarin, built on the basis of the imperial examination system. It is important to notice the situation in Hong Kong after the Second World War, and generally in the 20th century. Also, exactly Pacific War had a great importance. Japanese invasion and occupation of Hong Kong lasted until September 1945. When the war ended in 1945, much of the pressure over the future of Hong Kong has eased. Despite the great tension between Britain and China over the liberation of the British territory with the Chinese theater, Hong Kong was put under a military administration. The atmosphere in Hong Kong in 1946 was indeed different from before the war. the need for new administration to come with a new outlook was keenly observed and reported to London by senior British officials and officers. Hong Kong was immensely successful in restoring stability and in rehabilitating its economy. In Hong Kong, some changes were implemented as 1936 Governor Sir Andrew Cotley down the policy that in future no appointment would be made in Great Britain until the qualification of Hong Kong candidates had been first examined. Chinese to take an active part in the management of their territory. Colonial administration's positions under Grantham, governor after Yang after World War II, was to build passively a constructive partnership with the local people. The old discriminations that had been institutionalized before the war were quietly dropped.
Hong Kong existed mainly as Britain's gateway to China after the Second World War. When the communists came to power in China in 1949 and effectively closed its border with the British colonies the following year, Hong Kong has to survive. The colonial government had to increase its size to cope with the new demands. After the war and Japanese occupation, Hong Kong was put back under treasury control, which didn't end until it proved could be financially self-sustaining again in 1948. As a crown colony, Hong Kong could secure financial autonomy from metropolitan Britain only by persuading London it would not become a charge on the British exchequer. From cadets to administrative officers, Hong Kong reviewed its own structure and effectiveness of governance in the post-war era much more frequently than it had done before the war. Government in Hong Kong expanded at an unprecedented rate from 1950s to 1997. The growth of government was slower than in other countries. In 1950, the colonial government resisted the establishment of an independent social welfare office. The colonial administration continued to subscribe to the idea of a small government. The transformation of old-fashioned Secretariat of Chinese Affairs into the modern Secretariat for Home Affairs began with reforms of homes. Actually, expansion of the administration in fact gathered greater pace than ever as the 1960s drew to a close. The rally of the local Chinese to the colonial government during confrontation marked a turning point in the community's attitude. In coming out to support the government publicity, they expected it to look after their welfare. In the 1970s, Hong Kong was being rapidly transformed an imperial outpost into a city-state with a consolidating local citizenship and increasingly vibrant civil society. The coming of age of a new generation of young people born, brought up and educated locally who identified the Hong Kong ensured the top officials' recognition of a need to change. The beginning of decolonization, what is important to notice after World War II, began in some British lands, but at first it was not such incentive for Hong Kong to start localization. However, civil service expanded rapidly in the post-war era. There were more and more administrative positions, but the practice of importing experienced administrative officers also had a negative impact on morale among the more junior officers appointed specifically to serve in Hong Kong, as there were obstacles to local recruitment. Locals didn't really take off in Hong Kong until the late 1960s. The colonial government did try to recruit locally, but it did it so gingerly. The late 1960s and early 1970s ushered in a new era in Hong Kong and in its administration. New generation of locally born and raised young people identified strongly with Hong Kong. The colonial government's approach to handling community relations changed. The number of experienced colonial administrative officers available for import declined. Moreover, most of Hong Kong students were prone to start a career in administration.
In Hong Kong has finally been introduced the well-operated system of promotion and equal pay for equal work between local and expatriate officers became a reality only in 1982, when equal fringe benefits for all administrative officers was finally introduced. Additionally, women officers were given the scope to prove themselves and were they had the ability to demonstrate and gain advancement. Hong Kong administrative officers increasingly and consciously sought to combine the British colonial tradition with what they understood to be the rest of China's bureaucratic heritage. There was indeed an inherent compatibility between the modern British colonial administration and the ideal of Chinese bureau-centric tradition. From 1950 to 1990, the local population increased by roughly 1 million every decade. The government had to increase in size just to keep up with discharging its established duties. The old system suffered severe strain as top administrators saw their responsibilities expanding exponentially. This is why McKinsey was attracted to begin reformation. Shortly speaking, his reforms and advice generally included the modernization of administration. Recommendation included standardizing procedures and formats for various government departments to request resources from the central administration. The Colonial Secretariat was recognized into 6 policy branches and 2 resource branches, each headed by a secretary equal in rank to that of a head of major government department. Taking everything into consideration, Hong Kong during its colonial period under Britain could overcome difficulties and build its brilliant, well-operated administration, what is proved by all events and thoughts of mind which were mentioned in our discussion. Well, thank you ladies and gentlemen for your attention, keep in touch, and goodbye.